Chapel. Chapel Hill. I'm going to let him talk about him because he's better at it than me. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Tell us something interesting.
Hello. Oh. Good afternoon. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you all for being here. And yeah, we'll be thinking about Teresa's dad. That's really tough. So, yeah, I teach over in Chapel Hill, that UNC, right? And today I'm going to play an all Russian program for you. The reason for that is, I mean, I play music from all cultures, classical music, of course, but the reason Russian is a couple reasons. The main reason was that the Russian department at UNC asked me to do a concert of Russian music. This was last night. So that's the first practical reason. But the second reason is that my mother's Russian, and so is my uncle from Moscow. And I tell people, not Moscow, Idaho, but Moscow, the one in Russia. So my teacher was Russian in school, very Russian, I might add. His name is Vladimir, don't get more Russian than that. And so I feel close to that music. Of course, my dad is from, he's from Virginia. He's a 10th generation Virginian. So I joke with people, I say, I'm half Russian and I'm half redneck. So that's my background. Talking about the music, I think it's hard to generalize or make a survey of anything in music, especially Russian music, because you hear people say, oh, that sounds very Russian. But it's hard to make such a generalized statement because Russian culture is such a conglomeration of different cultures. I mean, look at what used to be the Soviet Union. You have people who are Tatars, Azerbaijanis, etc. It's just a melting pot. And the same goes for the music. A lot of Russian music, by the way, I've read that the folk music is very influenced by gypsy music, for example. Fascinating. So, classical music, written music in Russia was, I guess it was always around, particularly in the church, for the church singing, choral singing, Russian Orthodox choirs. It's beautiful music. But for classical concert music, I think probably the first major figure in that would be Glinka. And I'm not going to play Glinka. There's so many things I'm not playing on this program, maybe next time, but Glinka, and then those who sort of followed suit would be Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Balakirev, all these names. Great composers, all of them. Their aim was to create operas, symphonies, those forms, but with deeply Russian folk characteristics, with Russian folk tunes in the music. And the funny thing is, I'm going to play Tchaikovsky first. Tchaikovsky was looked at by them as a panderer to Western European styles. He wasn't considered very Russian. I find that funny because if you ask someone what's the most Russian composer, it's Tchaikovsky. Well, not according to, Borodin and those folks. So, the first piece I'll play is a waltz, actually, which is a Viennese dance, right? So, I think that these quarrels between musicians is kind of silly in retrospect, looking back. But that's just what it was. Everyone, was against each other. So, I'll start with Tchaikovsky. What to say about him? I think the typical Tchaikovsky genre would be the ballet, and opera too, but particularly ballets. Every Christmas season is the Nutcracker, right? And also Swan Lake is one of his masterpieces. And in his piano music, I just imagine ballet music. I don't know why. It's there. It's like breathing and living in his piano works. So the first piece I will play is called Valse Sentimentale. It's a funny thing too. He uses a French title. You read in Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, they speak French to each other mainly because Russia, they had this identity crisis, you can call it, that they wanted to be Russian on the one hand, but on the other hand, they felt that Russian and the Russian language was not sophisticated enough or something like that. Very strange, but that's what it was. So he gives French names to these pieces. Valse Sentimentale, but you will hear some of that, I call it Russian nostalgia in this piece. It's a very nostalgic piece. Anyway, I will play it, and first I'll check my device here. I'm never good with the technology, so yeah. Is it on? I think so. Good. These are always.
Was that going down?
Yes, yes,
Now it's going up.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, here we go. Yeah, this is the Valse Sentimentale by Tchaikovsky. It's the sentimental waltz.
So the genre you could call this would be salon music. There's also salon painting and French painting right before the Impressionists, you know. And so actually the setting, this is kind of like a salon performance. A big concert hall is, you know, maybe not the intended venue for a piece like that, I think. It's more for a smaller, you know, thing. I'm going to play another Tchaikovsky piece. It's called Meditation. And I don't know why he called it that, because it doesn't calm me down at all. But that's what he called it. You know, he had a very tragic life. And there's even some speculation that he committed suicide. I don't know, but you read about his life and it's just very dark. At the end, he wrote this symphony, the Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique, which tells you, you know, the title tells you something. and he reuses some of the same melodies in this piece as that symphony. So this is the Meditation of Tchaikovsky. It's one of his later works. wore his heart on his sleeve, you could say. And you know, whenever I hear my mom talking on the phone, and my dad also comments on this, you know, I'll ask her, what were you speaking about with your friend Olga or whoever it was? And she says, oh, the weather. And I said, well, but you sounded like some tragedy had happened, the way that the intonation of the language. And that might have something to do with the music too. There's a connection between music and language. So, and the culture, being very emotional is normal in Russian culture. So, next, speaking of emotional, I'm going to play some Rachmaninoff. So Rachmaninoff took some classes with Tchaikovsky in the Moscow Conservatory, and Tchaikovsky loved him. He gave him his blessing, actually, and to the young Rachmaninoff. But Rachmaninoff had a very different life sort of trajectory than Tchaikovsky, because he was, although he grew up poor, he was from a Russian aristocratic background. And so when 1917, the revolution happened, he had to skedaddle. They went to Europe first. He ended up actually in Beverly Hills, California, which is really, I find funny. This very serious Russian brooding composer, Rachmaninoff, was there. So I'm going to play 3 preludes by Rachmaninoff. And what to say about it is that his music is deeply nostalgic. Of course, he left his homeland. He never went back. Even before he left, I don't know, his music, this is from right before he left Russia, it still has this nostalgia. I think that the world changed so much at the turn of the 20th century. Maybe we're in a similar upheaval right now, I mean, with COVID and everything, but, you know, the arts changed after World War I, just completely. It was just a shift. And many composers like Rachmaninoff, he couldn't write much for 10 years after that war. I mean, just leaving Russia and all of the, you know, all of that. So, but these pieces, I think they evoke some of the things he describes in his letters, in his diary entries, about spending the summers in the countryside near Novgorod with his grandmother. And he describes in these letters the sounds of church bells. Big influence on his writing. You'll hear the sounds of bells a lot. He even wrote a symphonic poem called The Bells, with Edgar Allan Poe's text. I find that interesting. And an American writer, right? So, also Russian Orthodox choral music. And he was fairly religious too, so that's part of his musical style. And also the wide open meadows, spaces, wide open spaces. And you have that in American music and landscapes too, right? I mean, wide open spaces. Not so much in Vienna, for example, everything's cramped together. I make the comparison, if you think about Beethoven, who wrote, you know, bum, 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 that's his tune, short. Because Vienna is much closer together. I don't know, it's just a thought. Maybe I'm being out there. But Rachmaninoff wrote these long melodies, endless melodies, just like those wide open spaces. So the first prelude I'm going to play is in C minor, and I would say it's very oceanic. It's very vast. It has this feeling of, to me, of a stormy ocean. And there's a piece by Chopin, an etude by Chopin, that has been nicknamed The Ocean also, and they're similar, I think, very similar. So here's the first one, and we'll go one by one. This is a prelude by Rachmaninoff, Sergei Rachmaninoff.
stories too. So,
Yeah, the next piece is the B minor prelude, and this one, there's a story behind it, that his friend, the pianist Benno Moiseiwicz, Benno Moiseiwicz is from Odessa, and Odessa is on the Black Sea. It's a much warmer climate than Moscow, and it's kind of like New Orleans, actually. And people like to go by their nicknames there. Like, Louis Armstrong was Satchmo, right? Well, Benno is a nickname for Benjamin. Another Odessa pianist was Shura Cherkassky. Shura, oh, thank you, that's so kind of you. Water. So, have I need it with that Rachmaninoff? So, Shura is a nickname for Alexander. So, but anyway, Benno Moiseiwicz was not like Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff, I'll describe him a little bit, was, at some point he probably suffered from depression. He was 6.5 feet tall. He had a shaved head. Someone said he looked like an escaped convict. Stravinsky called him a 6.5-foot scowl. Not very nice. Well, but Rachmaninoff responded to that by calling Stravinsky Madame Butterfly. So, the musician insults are really a thing. It's an art form, too. But he was a rather dour and serious person. He had a sense of humor, I heard, but you would never see it. And I have another story later about him. And my grandfather, who met him, that's a different story. But anyway, Moiseiwicz tried to open Rachmaninoff up on this piece, so to speak. And he played this prelude on some of his concerts, and Benno would sort of tell Rachmaninoff, what did you have in mind when you wrote this? And Rachmaninoff would just shoo him away. So finally, they met for lunch in London, is where Benno lived. And Benno Moiseiwicz said, that prelude, and Rachmaninoff's probably thinking, here we go again. He said, it brings up a very specific image to my mind. And Rachmaninoff says, okay, proceed. And Benno says, okay, good, I won the first round with you. He said, it's a painting, it's called The Return. It's by a Swiss painter, Arnold Böcklin, and it's a man returning home, a Swiss soldier. Beautiful painting, it's late autumn, and it's in the mountains. And Rachmaninoff puts his arm out and he says, stop. That is exactly what I had in mind, too. The return. And all the connotations of that, nostalgia, memory. Even if we haven't been uprooted from our homelands, we all have been uprooted from our time when we grew up, everyone, and carries that nostalgia with them. So that's why I think this is such a universal feeling and experience for any human being. So you'll hear a lot of the Russian Orthodox choral music there, and the bells. I mean, that's what it is, I think. I hear it. So here's a B minor prelude. It's a pretty heavy piece, so here it is. I'm gonna play another prelude by Rachmaninoff, and you just tell me when I should stop, because I could go forever, and I don't wanna keep everyone, missing dinner or something. That's not good. It's not my intention. And of course, every Russian that I know will force me to eat until I can't move, so, But anyways, especially my mother. So, this prelude is just very bell-like. I would give it the title Bells if I could. I'll tell you a story about Rachmaninoff and my grandfather I mentioned. So this is not my Russian grandfather, my mom's, but this is my dad's father, Samuel Buxton, who went to, he's from Virginia, and he went to dental school in Richmond in the 30s. He's no longer around. Miss him a lot. He loved music. And as a young man in dental school, he got a job as an usher backstage at this concert series. And it was none other than Sergei Rachmaninoff was giving a recital there. And he had to guard this door. His boss told him, stand in front of this door, and if anybody tries to get through it, just don't let him. This door has to be closed. So, okay, that's your one job. So somebody tried to open that door 10 minutes later, and so my grandfather pushes back, and there's this tug of war between the two, and then finally, wham, the door opens, and it's 6.5 foot tall Rachmaninoff himself, and he spoke to my grandfather. I tell people that Rachmaninoff spoke to my grandfather. You know what he said? Get out of my way. Yeah. So I have a personal connection to this composer, and I don't hold it against him. But anyways, this is the prelude in B-flat major, I always forget this. B-flat major, and it's just very bell-like. Big piece. So, here it is.
I always get sweaty hands, it's just a thing.
funny, talking about Russian music. I played last night at the university, and the people were saying, Russian music, they must have drank a lot of vodka. Rachmaninoff didn't drink, he was a teetotaler. I found that really interesting. Yeah, he just was. And there's another story about Beno Moiseiwitsch, the guy I mentioned. He likes to drink. So, the story is, Rachmaninoff was complaining to Moiseiwitsch about a difficult passage in a piece that he wrote, actually, the Paganini Rhapsody. He said, there's this spot and there are these jumps. I just can't make them. And Beno Moiseiwitsch said, well, just, drink some creme de menthe before the performance. And Rachmaninoff said, I'm a teetotaler, I would never do that. He said, just do it. Now, the side note, Moiseiwitsch, one of my teachers in New York, he went to a recital of Moiseiwitsch. He was very little, and Moiseiwitsch was quite old. He went backstage afterwards. He said he was drunk as a skunk, so that tells you something. But Rachmaninoff tried it, and he had a good performance, and he called that piece the creme de menthe variation as a result. So that's a little story about that. But other than that, he was a well-behaved guy. So that's Rachmaninoff. Next, I'm going to play a less-known composer, but a wonderful composer, Nikolai Medtner. Probably never, that name is not too familiar. He's played in Russia somewhat, but not so much here. And Medtner was a Volga German, which means that by his ethnicity, he was German. Like the pianist Sviatoslav Richter was also Volga German. But he was born and raised in Russia. And like Rachmaninoff, he was kind of from an aristocratic background, and he had to get out. And he tried to stay with the Soviets, I think, for a little bit, and it just didn't work. So in the 20s, a little later, a little after Rachmaninoff, he left. And they were close friends, by the way, very close friends. And they were both derided by many as being throwbacks to the Romantic era, in a time when people were doing more modernistic experiments in music. It's not true. Some of their music is quite innovative. We think that now, but at the time, they looked at them as kind of old hat, right? So, particularly Medtner. And Medtner even wrote a book about why conservative musical styles should not be replaced by new modern things. He wrote a whole book on it. Medtner did not get the sort of fame Rachmaninoff did because Rachmaninoff was, he came to the US and he made a life for himself as a touring concert pianist. Medtner just stayed, he lived in London and he just taught lessons, practiced and did recordings, but he didn't ever do that kind of a touring thing. Wonderful pianist, by the way. And what to say about his music, his melodies are not quite as broad as Rachmaninoff's. They're a little bit shorter ideas. I make this comparison. If Rachmaninoff's music is like an ocean or a very vast thing, Medtner's music is more like a cool forest. That's how I imagine it. And this piece is called Fairy Tale, or Skazka. He wrote many skazki, and he wrote many sonatas and a lot of things with wonderful titles, fanciful titles. But this fairy tale, when I played it for my mom, she said, I see the snow falling outside of Moscow and the birch trees. That's exactly what she said, and I like that image for this piece. Nikolai Medtner, Fairy Tale in B-flat minor, and there's an example of some repertoire. I strongly believe that there is a lot of great music out there that's not played enough. And it's not only the big names, and of course there's bad music, but that's another topic. But there's a lot of this is a great composer, Medtner. So anyway, Fairy Tale in B-flat minor. composer who was truly crazy, I could say, Alexander Scriabin. And, and I'll explain why I say that. So in his young years, he was so enamored with Nietzsche, the philosopher. He even tried to look like him. If you look at his picture, he had the same mustache as Nietzsche. Also Wagner and Chopin, so much so that some people say that his early compositions, it's like Chopin is just living through him. He did not live very long, but in his later years, he joined a cult. I don't know or want to know, but very strange, and his music became atonal, pretty much, and experimental. And he started writing his final piece called Mysterium, which was supposed to be played, this is kind of megalomania, it was supposed to be performed at the foothills of the Himalayan mountains over 7 days. It was going to have smells, colors, screens. I mean, it was going to be this big event. Think of like Woodstock or something, I don't know. But he started this piece and he died in the middle. I think he got either a bug bite or melanoma or something right on his nose, and he just died at 45 or something. It's horrible. He's a great composer and a very bizarre person, I would say. And he was, friends with Rachmaninoff. They all knew each other. Rachmaninoff and Scriabin, they had the same piano teacher when they were adolescents and kids. So they shared that experience. The difference, though, is Scriabin, Rachmaninoff he probably had Marfan's syndrome. They say his hands were very big, but they had a lot of pain because the joints, Scriabin was the opposite. He was a very small guy, and his hands were small, but he wrote these pieces with huge leaps in them. And I think he injured himself doing that, his hands. But anyway, the first piece is an etude, which just means study. It could be a study for technique, but I think it's not. I think etudes in music, there's studies in expression and, more. So this piece is from kind of the early to middle period. And you can hear the Chopin, even Liszt and Wagner, sort of the Nietzsche in there. So Vladimir Horowitz, as a young boy, 11 years old, he met Scriabin. And he described him as follows. He said he was a very nervous man with nervous twitches in his face and his hands. And I think I hear that in the music. If maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but there's this rhythm that shows up in his music all the time, and it goes pa-pum, pa-pum. It's like a nervous tick or twitch. I'll show it to you before I play the piece, And it has a lot of pathos to it as well. It's, you hear it all the time. It's just like this splash of. So that's Scriabin. I'll play 2 etudes, one from his younger years, this one, and then one from his very late years when he went off into some strange things. So yeah, but fascinating. I don't mean to diminish, that side of him. So I just don't recommend, joining cults. That's all. to it. They didn't let me drink water at the university. All right, so I'm going to play another Scriabin. This is a short one, Etude. And this is from his later years. I forgot to mention this defining characteristic of him was that he had a condition. I don't know if he made it up, but he claims to have had this condition called synesthesia, which is, it's fascinating. It's that he saw color, in music. And he had even a whole system that he wrote out that certain keys and certain chords, they had colors for him. Like this would be, yellow or brown or beige. That's really interesting. I think that he had an argument with Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff said, I don't agree with that. That's ridiculous. And Scriabin argued, well, anyway. But this late piece, it's completely atonal, almost. And, it's modernistic, like a Picasso painting or something. So, he described one of his late sonatas, not this piece, but it works for this piece. He described it as music of night insects. Very weird. It's kind of a Salvador Dali type thing. But anyway, here's the Scriabin, late Etude, last Etude of his.
I think it's 1914 or something like that. The year World War I started, so,
I have to give a disclaimer because I don't want to just play that and people think. So, next I'm going to play these are very short pieces by Sergei Prokofiev. And Prokofiev was, he hated all these guys before him. He looked at them as, old hat, romantics, old fuddy-duddies, whatever you want to call them. And he was a sort of enfant terrible. He wrote modernistic music. He went to Paris in the 20s and before and worked with the Ballet Russe. He was kind of following suit with Stravinsky, although actually they didn't like each other, but that's a whole other story. They all hated each other, these people, But anyways, actually, I heard that, Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky, they really hated each other, but at some point in the 40s, they were both in LA, near LA, and they got together and they just reminisced about old Russia before the revolution. So funny, two different worlds of music. I mean, one is this arch modernist and the other is this romantic. So Prokofiev wrote these pieces. These are called Fairy Tales of a Russian Grandmother, or Babushka. And the description, it says this grandmother is telling these stories to her grandson. The pianist Richter said this. He said, and he knew Prokofiev, because the funny thing is Prokofiev he lived in New York and Paris, and after the revolution, he somehow, it's very strange, he went back to the Soviet Union because he missed Russia too much. And his family was there, relatives, and he formed an uneasy relationship with the authorities, like Shostakovich too. Sometimes he was in favor, sometimes he was not in favor with Stalin, actually, in the last years. And he died on the same day as Stalin, a few hours before. He would have loved the irony of that. But anyways, Richter said about Prokofiev, he said the reason Prokofiev hated Rachmaninoff so much was because he was secretly influenced by him. You hear the same things in a different light, but the same Russian Orthodox choral music and bells, they're there in his music, even though he's more dissonant and experimental. Prokofiev, he wrote some very noisy pieces. These are not noisy. And I think there's a misconception that he was a sort of a mechanical, bombastic composer. Not at all. Prokofiev himself said, my main goal in composing is to find beautiful melodies. And like Tchaikovsky, he wrote ballets mainly. So anyway, these are two very short pieces. I'll play them just almost as one. Two pieces out of this set, Fairy Tales of a Russian Babushka.
So, maybe, well, we're kind of at the end. I think I'll do one more. Is that okay if I do? Okay, so, I don't want to keep everyone, so,
I love this piece. This is the Liebeslied by Fritz Kreisler, arranged by Rachmaninoff. So it's a violin piece. Fritz Kreisler, this is the only sort of non-Russian piece because Kreisler was from Vienna, and this is a typical Viennese waltz with the rhythm of ba-yum, bum, ba-dum, but that's a Viennese waltz. It's not boom, chuck, chuck, boom. No, it's that second beat, da-dum, that is quicker. So Kreisler was quite a character. He hated to practice. And he was very good friends with Rachmaninoff, and they did a recital together. And this is a true story. And actually, I'm starting to think maybe Rachmaninoff did have a sense of humor. It was just dry humor. Because they were playing, I think, the Grieg Sonata in Carnegie Hall, and Fritz Kreisler got lost in the music. And he's improvising something, Rachmaninoff keeps playing, and he walks over to Rachmaninoff in the middle of the concert in Carnegie Hall, and he says, "Hey, Sergei, where are we?" And Rachmaninoff says, with no emotion, "Carnegie Hall." So I love that story. So the Liebeslied means love's sorrows. And if there's a piece that captures both happiness and sadness all at the same time, it would be this. And I had this epiphany over the summer that I wished I had learned the violin, not the piano, because I love violin music and violinists. There's a guy named Ivry Gitlis who died recently. He was 98, and he played this so well, the violin version. And somebody told me, "You can still learn violin." I said, "Well, I could, but it's not that it's too late, I'm just too lazy." So, but I can play arrangements. And so Rachmaninoff arranged, and he puts his own musical voice in there too, like a translation of a novel from one language to another. The style of the translator gets into the translation too. So it's kind of a combination of these two people. All right, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Teresa, for organizing this. And we will be thinking about your dad. I really hope things improve. So, yeah, Liebeslied by Kreisler, and then we'll conclude. So here we are.
Prince Chrysler is a violin, but I want to arrange it for the piano. Because,
Here's the last part of the story.
thank you.
This is,
Oh, I had a guy named Vladimir Viardo,
they
a
got
Russian
the thing out
teacher
of the mud.
in Texas, yeah. And he was very close with Ben Clyburn, you know, he was, working, oh yeah, Ben Clyburn. So, and then a guy named Solomon Constantine in New York, I studied when I was an undergrad.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
This
very
was
much.
so wonderful.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We've had spree, I've been one night.
Oh, yeah. You don't hear that every day. So,
Look at that.
that's it.